DNS Part 1. For a lot of Exam Pack 70-297, I'm just assuming that you already know a competent level of knowledge for whatever respective technology we're discussing. However, for DNS, it's pretty essential that you really have a solid understanding of it all. So I'm going to kind of review a little bit more rudimentarily, if that's a word, the various issues relating to DNS in this Part 1 and in the upcoming nugget, Part 2. First of all, we'll discuss the zone types, such as primary, secondary, and Active Directory integrated, as well as application directory partitions. We'll also take a look at dynamic update as well as reverse lookup and pointer records. One thing to understand as well is what kind of bind integrations are allowed, what's compatible. Bind is a tried and true method of DNS servers, and so we'll take a look at bind DNS servers a little bit. We'll also take a look at delegations. You'll want to understand how you can resolve child namespaces, but that's no longer as favored as stub zones, which will automatically update themselves, and we'll look at those as well. And finally, we'll conclude with conditional forwarding. You know, I think we all understand the importance of getting a person's name right. A friend of mine was supposed to meet me in a coffee shop a while back, so I went to the coffee shop and I was going to meet this guy who also, by the way, is a database architect who owns the company that merged two major U.S. banks together, and if I named the banks, you'd certainly know them. Anyway, this friend of mine is pretty large and kind of stocky, and when you look at him, he doesn't look like a nice fellow. He has a very intimidating, kind of a gruff look about him, and he's really very nice, but he doesn't look that way. Anyway, I saw him in line. Apparently, he'd gotten there ahead of me, and I decided to, in my typically mature and composed fashion, sneak up behind this guy and grab him by the shoulders and startle him. So I did just that. I grabbed him by the shoulders and I startled him, and I said, "Hey, Victor." That's his name, Victor. Well, there have been two cases of seriously bad mistaken identity in my life. The first one occurred when I thought another woman was my wife. We don't need to go into that detail right now. And the other one was when I shook this person by the shoulders who I thought was Victor, and the guy turned around, and it turned out he wasn't, but he was still very big, still very mean, and was not very happy with me. At least he looked mean, and actually he turned out to have a pretty good humor about the situation, but certainly that could have turned out worse than it started off. In any case, we also have that kind of an issue with DNS. You've got to make sure that you identify the right hostname with the right IP address, or that it can be identified at all, and that you keep all of your data current. And here I've gone ahead and opened up the DNS Management Console from Administrative Tools on the Start menu. Now, although you should already be familiar with many of these things, because DNS is so critical to Active Directory and to your whole network infrastructure, let's just review a couple of things and when you would want to use certain parts of DNS or certain implementations of DNS. And here you can see that I've got just the conventional forward lookup zone for an Active Directory integrated zone for NuggetsLab.com, along with its accompanying _msdcs.nuggetlab.com zone, which of course is where we'll locate SRV records that identify where my global catalog servers are and domain controllers and things of that nature. But let's step off of that for a minute and go back to a little bit more of a fundamental DNS environment, which is where we would have primary and secondary DNS zones. And I'm just going to use this kind of as a conventional drawing board for a lot of different contexts that I'll have in this nugget. Here, for example, maybe we've just got standard primary cbtnuggets.com zone, and that's going to be a primary zone. Remember that a primary will be a read-write copy of the database. If I have any other DNS servers that I want to install for redundancy purposes or for availability, then those will be only read copies of the same zone. And what would happen is we would, of course, have zone transfers going from this primary over here to this secondary. This would still be an authoritative name server. It's just that you cannot make write changes to it. Now, frankly, in our current context for the Exam Pack 70-297, very rarely will we have a need for this kind of an implementation. Most of what we'll be doing will be with Active Directory integrated zones. And although we don't use this typically in Active Directory, you will have Active Directory integrated zones, and you may also have additional DNS servers out here, such as maybe you've got bind administrators that just love and cherish their bind DNS servers and don't want to let them go. That's fine. Bind is very good, and it's very reliable and time-proven. Now, what we would do in this kind of a situation, perhaps, would be we would continue to use our Active Directory primary DNS server here for our NuggetsLab.com zone, and then we would just make this a read-only secondary copy where we perform zone transfers to this bind server. And Microsoft has tested bind 4.9.7, 8.1, 8.2, and 9.1.0 with success. Do remember, however, that you need at least bind 8.1.2 in order to support SRV records and dynamic updates. But again, that will not be secure dynamic updates, just dynamic updates. So I made a note to that effect up here, 8.1.2 for Active Directory integration. Now, there's another issue you might want to be aware of if you have bind secondaries, and you can see that issue if you right-click on the server here in DNS and choose Properties and go to the Advanced tab. From here we see a selected checkbox that says Bind Secondaries. Now, contrary to Microsoft's online help system, this is selected by default, whereas the online help system says it's deselected. Now, this really is not an issue unless you're dealing with older bind servers. And on all my DNS servers that I'm going to integrate with bind or use for bind secondaries, I'll clear that because all current versions of bind will allow you to use fast zone transfers so that it can transmit many records in every single packet and compress the data. And in order for it to be able to support those many packets that compress data in zone transfers, you have to use bind 4.9.4 or better. Now, if you have an older version of bind than that, that's when you will need to select this, which will then disable that new feature of sending many records in a packet and compressing the zone transfer data. And I've also made a note of that here for you as well, bind 4.9.4 or greater for fast zone transfers. Now let's just review quickly also where we configure all of these things. You can do this when you first create the zone through a wizard to identify whether you want it to be Active Directory integrated, or if you want to change that, you can click the Change button here from the General tab. And I could deselect storing it in Active Directory, which would then, of course, store it in nuggetlab.com.dns text file, which is located under Windows, System 32, and DNS. The other thing, of course, that I could do here would be to store it as a secondary zone. And if I click OK here, it's going to prompt me to specify whether I no longer want to store it in Active Directory. I'll say yes. I'm not going to actually click the final OK here, though. This will just be for purposes of this demonstration. And then what I would have to do is I'd have to identify the IP address of whatever the server is that hosts the primary copy of the zone. And then finally, what we can also do is to make it just a stub zone, which is going to store a copy of the zone only containing named server record, SOA records, and A records, which are also known as glue record. It doesn't always store the glue records unless the server is also registered in that same zone. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, however. Now, if it is an Active Directory integrated zone, which is what I've gone back to here, then you can also specify the replication scope so that we can specify that we want it to replicate to all DNS servers, which is the default, in the Active Directory domain. And this is something that's new with Windows Server 2003, because in Windows 2000 it didn't have a way of differentiating from the DNS data in the ntds.dit file and all of the other conventional Active Directory data. So it would just have to send the entire glob, including DNS, to all domain controllers, even if those domain controllers were not DNS servers. Now, if you do have Windows 2000 domain controllers in your environment, then you'll have to specify this option so that it will still have to send it to all domain controllers in Active Directory domain. So in other words, this option here is your Windows 2000 backwards compatibility option. You'll be better off with this option, or better yet, you might choose to go to this option, which would send it to all DNS servers in the Active Directory forest of nuggetlab.com. Now, in a multi-domain environment with multiple domains in a forest, this would, of course, give you the highest availability for this specific zone, but you have to balance that with the replication traffic, because if this particular zone is extremely heavy, it's got a lot of frequent registrations and deregistrations, then it's going to increase the replication traffic throughout your entire forest. So it sounds like a good idea in terms of availability, and it is, but you have to balance that with the kind of replication traffic that you can afford. And if it's too burdensome, then you might just back it down to this option that I mentioned earlier. And then in order to make it available to other DNS servers that might not be able to receive this information because they're not in your same domain, maybe they're in cbtnuggets.com instead of nuggetlab.com, then you could do something like creating a stub zone or a conditional forward for those other DNS servers so that they can still locate this zone. Now then, there's one other thing that's unavailable here at this point, and that's because I don't have any application directory partitions that I've created. But if I had specific data that perhaps an application wanted to use, and I only wanted to replicate it to a very narrow scope of DNS servers, then I could identify an application directory partition, and we've discussed this in other series that I've done. In any case, just to quickly review that, if I wanted to create an application directory partition, what I could do is go to a command line and use the DNSCMD command, and you can pause the screen if you want to look at the syntax, or if you just do a DNSCMD followed by a / question mark, or look at the online help system, that gives you more information there as well. In any case, what I want to do is on DC Nugget 1 is to create a directory partition. Boy, couldn't they have made that any shorter? And I want to call it data.nuggetlab.com, and once I've done that, it's gone ahead and created it for me. And then after I've created it here, if I want to enlist the directory partition on a different server, so in other words, I want to replicate it to only this other additional server here, then I can use the DNS command to also do that. And then whatever data I populate in this data.nuggetlab.com will not only remain on DC Nugget 1, but will also replicate over to DC Nugget 2. No, I don't actually have a DC Nugget 2 that is capable of accepting that right now, so I'm going to Control-C to cancel that. But if I did, then I would also, if I wanted to remove that application directory partition, what I would have to do is pretty much just reverse this. I would go to DNSCMD DC Nugget 2, and then my next command would actually be, if I can do it, unenlist directory partition. So it would be unenlist directory partition here. And then after I'd unenlisted it here, I would then delete it on the original server that had the originating directory partition. No, I haven't actually done any of this except for this first one where I created the directory partition. So let's just go ahead and go back to the zone here and choose properties. Now if I go back into this, now we see that this checkbox or this radio button now becomes available, and I can choose data.nuggetlab.com, to which I want this zone data to be replicated. And this is kind of a specialized purpose. You don't use this every day. You might have some kind of an application or some special purpose where you want to replicate very granular data around with application directory partitions. Now that I've shown that to you, I don't actually need that application directory partition. So here I went ahead and executed this command to delete the directory partition. And if I go back into the zone again here, choose properties and go to change, we see that it's no longer available now. And of course, you also want to enable this for secure dynamic updates if you want your host records for all of your clients that register themselves within DNS to be available. And you can do that by going to the properties of the zone and choosing properties. And I see here that I've got my dynamic updates set to none in this case. By default, normally if you follow the wizard through, it'll prompt you if you want to choose secure and non-secure, none, or secure, and you see all the same options here. Typically, we choose secure only because of obvious purposes. You can also choose non-secure and secure, but then it opens you up to DNS poisoning and to certain redirections and other things that would not be desirable in your environment. Typically, I always choose secure only, and that's what I should click OK for here right now. And by having chosen secure, that will allow any current Windows client to register themselves within DNS. And it's secure because they have to first authenticate that they are indeed who they say they are before they have the capability of doing that. And that prevents DNS poisoning or some other hacker methods where someone could plug into my network and enter in a bunch of false registrations or change someone's registration. Now remember also you can configure a reverse lookup zone that will allow you to resolve an IP address to a name instead of a name to an IP address as we do with our forward lookup zones. I don't have any reverse lookup zones right now, but just for drill, let's go ahead and create one real quick here, and we'll just follow the wizard through. I'll make it a primary Active Directory integrated zone, and I'll replicate it to all the DNS servers in the Active Directory domain of nuggetlab.com. Remember that for your network ID, just enter in your network portion of your IP address space in reverse. So if my IP address space was 10.9.8, I would enter it in reverse. That would be 8.9.10. In my case, it's all 10, so I'll just do it that way. And then we'll go ahead and click on Next. And then you can, again, allow secure dynamic updates, which is the best option and most secure option. Then just Next and Finish. That's really pretty much all there is to it. Now, when clients register their forward lookup host records, they can also register a pointer record in the reverse lookup. Now then, what do you want to use reverse lookup zones? Well, that might be useful if you need to identify a server specifically. For example, maybe there's a server on my network or some host on my network that's spewing out a lot of broadcast packets. I can't figure out which one it is. I know its IP address. I don't know what the name of the computer is, though. Well, I could do a ping -A to locate it. So, for example, if I go to a command prompt here and I do a ping-A or -A, and then I want to find out who 10.10.10.20 is and press enter, then with the reverse lookup and a pointer record there, it'll identify which specific server or host that is. And you might also want to use reverse lookup zones for several Unix applications that require reverse lookup in order to find the resources necessary for that application. Now, another thing we might have is a child domain. So, for example, here on DC Nugget 2, which is a host for the Tucson.nuggetlab.com zone, which I've configured as a standard primary, I need to also configure this zone so that people can resolve to that child domain. I need to configure this zone with either a delegation or a stub zone, or you could use conditional forwarding. Let's start off with a delegation, which is probably the least desirable of those three choices. Now, recall that a delegation, to create one, you right-click on the name of the parent zone, choose New Delegation, go through the wizard, and identify what the name of the zone is. So in this case, it's Tucson, and click on Next. And then I'm going to add the fully qualified domain name of DC Nugget. And having done that, I can then click Resolve, which resolves it to this IP address, and then I'll click OK. And now, clicking on Next and Finish, it will identify Tucson as a delegated zone for nuggetlab.com. And that way, when clients try to resolve a host within tucson.nuggetlab.com and it goes to DC Nugget 1 to make that resolution, well, it'll be able to identify the name server, the authoritative name server for tucson.nuggetlab.com right here. Notice again in the delegation, there's not actually host records here, only NS records. Now, this does not automatically update. If I've changed this from DC Nugget 2 to DC Nugget 3 or DC Nugget 4, or if I just added or subtracted a few name servers here, this has no way of automatically updating. I have to go in here and manually update this delegation. And so again, the delegations simply resolve child domains from a parent domain like this. Now, one thing I could do is I could create a root zone on DC Nugget 1, which would just be a zone of dot. Yes, that's right, just dot. And that would identify it as the top-level namespace within all of DNS. That would also prevent me from being able to go out to the internet to resolve internet names, by the way, because it would tell the world that this DNS server is the authority in the entire universe of DNS. Now, if I do that, I could also create a delegation for something like, cbtnuggets.com or something else like that, because that would be a child of dot. But in my current environment here, where I don't have a dot zone, I could not create a delegation for cbtnuggets.com because it has to be a child of something, and without the dot, it has nothing to be a child of within my existing space here. Now, delegations work, but again, they have to be manually updated, and I don't like them anywhere near as much as I like stub zones. And Microsoft didn't invent stub zones. They've been around for a long time in other implementations. Microsoft's resource kit, however, frequently references delegations as opposed to stub zones. I don't know why that is, because stub zones are just plain better. It could be because stub zones weren't fully developed in Microsoft's DNS before the resource kit was written, but I prefer to delete this and get rid of a delegation, and then instead to create a stub zone. In order to do that, oops, I right-clicked in the wrong place. In order to do that, I'd right-click on Forward Lookup Zones, choose New Zone, click Next here, and create a stub zone instead. And I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of this offline, and when I come back, I'm going to go ahead and show you the stub zone and tell you what the advantages of it are. Alright, now I've gone ahead and created the tucson.nuggetlab.com stub zone. Notice that it also includes the start of authority here, and it includes the NS record for DC Nugget 2. Now, if I add an additional name server, DC Nugget 3, let's say, then that will automatically appear here so that it updates itself. There could also potentially be a glue record here or an A record. Now, the reason why we don't see it here is because it only appears in the same zone in which the name server registers itself. DC Nugget 2 is not a part of tucson.nuggetlab.com. You can see here, DC Nugget 2 is part of nuggetlab.com, and here we've got DC Nugget 2. That's where the glue record is for tucson.nuggetlab.com. In any case, I much prefer stub zones because it has this automatic updating capability, and it's therefore a more efficient way of resolving child domains. Now, although it's commonly used to resolve child domains like I've got here, you don't have to use it for just child domains. I could right now create a stub zone. If I had another DNS server that hosted cbtnuggets.com, I could create a stub zone for that. I could create a stub zone for any server that would allow me to identify the name server records or NSOA records on that DNS server. I've done in the past, I've created stub zones for google.com. They didn't give me permission to do that or anything. You can just do it because that's what DNS is. It makes available name server records and startup authority records. That's what they're supposed to do for public DNS servers. Now, another way to resolve queries for zones that this DNS server is not authoritative for is to configure conditional forwarding by going to the properties of the server, going to the Forwarders tab, and clicking New, and then just adding in a DNS namespace here, a DNS domain. I've already done that for this domain, which is another domain I have on this network. And then you just simply enter in its IP address here as well. And now, anytime a host tries to query against this DNS server for any host in AccuSource.net, it'll immediately send that query over to 10.10.10.4. And that prevents me from having to store the zone entirely on here or setting this DNS server up as a secondary and therefore having to configure a lot of additional zone transfer traffic. So I don't have that zone transfer cost, and yet at the same time, we can still resolve against AccuSource.net because we have this IP address configured. Now, as is the case with delegations, a conditional forward will not automatically update itself if there's been a change to the DNS server that hosts that zone. So for AccuSource.net, if 10.10.10.4 is now changed to 10.10.10.5, there's no way for me to know that without the administrator of that zone telling me. But regardless, with all of these, delegation stub zones and conditional forwards, the big advantage to remember is that we don't have to perform any zone transfers. And so if you're trying to avoid zone transfer traffic, these are all three good methods to avoid that. In this nugget, we took a look at DNS, and this was part 1. Now again, DNS is a critical part of understanding what you need to know for the exam pack of 70-297. So we took a look at a lot of the things that you should already know about, but which we want to make sure that you're solid on. So we reviewed, for example, the various zone types, primary, secondary, Active Directory integrated, as well as application directory partitions. We also took a look at dynamic update. Of course, we saw that the best way to do this is to use secure dynamic update, and you can only use that, by the way, if you're using Active Directory integrated zones. And a secure dynamic update will help to prevent DNS poisoning and redirections that are not desired. Also, we took a look at reverse lookup zones, and this will help us to resolve IP addresses to names instead of the forward lookup zones, which of course are name to IP address resolutions. Now, reverse lookups are important for some Unix applications, so you may want to go ahead and implement them so that you have those pointer records available. We also took a look at bind. Remember, you're going to have at least bind.8.1.2 in order to support Active Directory in most of its implementation. However, if you're only using bind DNS servers, you're not going to be able to support secure dynamic updates. But at least it supports SRV records, which allow you to find things like your global catalog servers and domain controllers. And we also took a look at delegations, which is a little bit of an older way of resolving child namespaces, but it's better to use stub zones because they automatically update themselves. Also, we can use conditional forwards to look out for other namespaces that a given DNS server would not otherwise be able to resolve. And then finally, I think the most important lesson we learned is that you do not sneak up behind somebody to try to scare them unless, number one, you're sure that they cannot beat you up, and number two, they are indeed the person who you think they are. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.